to this webinar, so I have a feeling there'll be some people filtering in as this presentation goes on. So thank you for joining us for this presentation, Population Estimates 101, with Luke Rogers from the Population Estimates Branch at the United States Census Bureau. Population estimates is incredibly important information, is incredibly important data. So we want to make sure that there's two things we accomplished during this webinar. The first is that you're using this data. You understand that it's available, and you understand that there is some really appropriate and important uses for this information. The second is that we want to spend some time today talking about how it's produced, not just the methodology that goes into producing it, in all the various products that come out throughout the year, but also in understanding some of the ways in which Tennessee's local data is incorporated into the population estimates. It is incredibly important information. Like I said, it's used for funding, it's used for survey controls for things like the American Community Survey, the current population survey, which estimates our unemployment rate and labor force participation, for instance. Communities across the state use it to see if they're growing, how much they're growing, how fast they're growing, why they're growing. Is it an influx of people? Is it been a change to the vital patterns in a community? What it is that causes the population to change? And of course, here at the Boyd Center, one of the primary uses for us is producing the state's population projections. These are tied heavily into the data that the Population Estimates program produces. So I think you're going to learn a lot today. I'm very excited to have a good number of people from cities and counties on the line joining us. So I think if you have any questions, I want to just emphasize one thing before we get started, and that is the State Data Center has a vested interest in the population estimates through the Federal States Cooperative for Population Estimates program. We serve as the representative for the state of Tennessee. And so we're in these things all year long. And if you have questions throughout the year, feel free to contact us, especially if you see any issues or have any questions about the data. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. The first is that we are recording this webinar. You probably got that notification in your Teams window. We will email the link to the webinar out after this in case you miss anything, or if you want to share this with another colleague. The other thing is I want to talk about how we're going to handle questions and answers today. Typically during these Teams presentations, what you'll see is that people open up the chat window and you can type your questions into the chat window during the course of the presentation. So what we've learned is that our UTK version of Teams does not permit that. So you can't ask a question in the chat window. So there's going to be two ways that you'll be able to ask a question during today's presentation. The first is if you're using the Teams app. So not in the browser, if you're not using this in the browser window, but you're using this in the Teams app, there'll be a Q&A panel at the top of the ribbon bar, kind of in the top right-hand corner on my version of it. You can press that and you can type a question into that, and then we'll feed that to Luke at the end of the presentation, let him respond to those. So as you're going along and you're using the app, you can type them in there. If you don't have the app, what we're going to do, if you're using the browser, so if this is in a tab in your browser window, after the presentation is done, we'll ask you to raise your hand, and you can find the raise your hand in the button. It's in the reactions menu, so you can look for that in the reactions menu. Press it's the icon on the left, and it's kind of got a little hand signal like that. So raise your hand, and what you'll ask you to do is just to unmute, ask your question directly to Luke, and let him answer it. Is there anything we can't get to? Feel free to respond to me if things come up afterwards. Let me know. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker. I'm not sure exactly who's pitch hitting for who, but we did have a change of speaker, and it's a blockbuster trade deal because we have Dr. Luke Rogers with the U.S. Census Bureau. Luke is the chief of the Population Estimates Branch. He's been with the Census Bureau since 2014 as a demographer in the Population Estimates Branch, and also spent some time in the Population Evaluation and Projections Branch. As an analyst, Luke specialized in vital statistics, and since 2017, he served as chief of the Population Estimates Branch. Before he began at the Census Bureau, he worked as a senior research assistant to Dr. Kenneth Johnson at the University of New Hampshire's Kersey School of Public Policy, where he was also awarded his doctoral degree in sociology, focusing on environmental demography. So Luke, I will stop sharing. You can share your screen. Welcome. I know this is a super busy time, as I mentioned to you earlier, for the population estimates group, but we want to thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And thanks for the introduction. So yeah, my name's Luke. I'm with the population estimates branch. I don't think I need to say much more about me. I think you covered it pretty well. But this presentation will be focusing on a pretty high level summary of our methodology, our data products, our relationship with the FSCPE, and you'll have a chance to ask me any questions you have at the end, or if you want to jump in the middle. I don't think I would have an issue with that. It's, I guess it's up to you all. So the order of the presentation will first, I'll just talk about our program, the Population Estimates and Projections program. The population estimates and projections that are officially out of the United States Census Bureau are both created in our program area. I'll go over some general estimates and projections PEP concepts. We have some interesting words that we use that you'll see on our website, and it might get a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with words like vintage or estimate series and things like that. I'll talk about post-census estimates production overview, which is what we're currently making right now. We're in the midst of our production cycle. I'll talk about some of our methods, the different input data sources we use, and the different products that come out. And then, like I said, we'll have questions and discussion after. So about us. So like I said, we're the area of the United States Census Bureau that creates the official measures of the population housing units between decennial censuses. So, you know, we have the enumeration every 10 years, but in between those, we still need population estimates for many, many reasons. And that's where our program comes in. We have a legal mandate to create our estimates, and we have a deadline to deliver things to like the Senate clerk hire, the FEC. We have so many different public data or data extracts that we deliver over the year, over 150, I think, that go to different, you know, the National Center for Health Statistics, different universities, different researchers.
Hey, Luke, can I just stop you for 1 second?
Sure.
We're seeing your PowerPoint like draft mode, not the presentation mode. There you go. Thank you.
I talked to Tracy a little bit about the January board meetings. How are they going to set them up? I was going to try to get that bid out this week and have it open in like December.
Can everyone please check that you're staying muted? And Luke, we've lost you. Are you there?
No, I was muted myself.
Okay.
So yeah, we create things. Our estimates are used as denominators for things like fertility rates, mortality rates, different statistics that you would see. They need a denominator of the population to measure those types of things. A lot of different universities or businesses will do research with our estimates, and also different states, public or private, in the public or private sector, they'll use our data just for their own purposes, you know, financial planning, business planning, things like that. So we release our data every year over a cycle, and I'll kind of go over this next, but it's an annual cycle where we start from the most recent census day, and we work our way forward using administrative data. So currently the estimates that are out go from April 1st, 2020, which is the date of our last decennial census, to July 1st, 2021. And soon we'll be releasing the following year. So data for July 2022 will be released starting in December. So as I said, we release our data every year, and what we do when we do this, when we release our data, we go back and we redo the entire time series starting at the last census day. So when right now, like I said, we have the April 2020 to July 2021 estimates are out. But when we release data in December, we go back and we'll redo from April 2020 to July 2022. So the reason we do this is we might get updated input data on vital statistics or migration, or we might have methodological changes that we want to make sure that all the years are estimated in a consistent manner. So the cycle really is done progressively over the year. So this December, we'll be releasing the national and state level total populations, components of change, and voting age population. And then in March of next year, we'll be releasing county total population and components of change. And usually we would release the metro micropolitan areas at this point, but there's we're waiting for the new delineations to come out so that we can include things like the Connecticut counties. So Connecticut switched to planning regions. So we want to make sure that we cover all the metro micropolitan areas using the same delineation file, which is just how we roll up the counties into metro or micro areas. In April, we'll release our first set of demographic characteristics. It'll be the national population by age and sex, single age up to 100 plus, I think, and male, female. Then in May, we will release the city and town total population estimates, and then we'll also release the nation, state, and county level housing unit estimates. And then finally, our last big release is the nation, state, county level populations by full detail, age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And so we have different files. We have a file that does race alone or in combination, and then we have a file that's just race alone, and they just for different uses. So let's talk about some of the concepts that you'll see if you get into our data products. So there's different types of products, and I'll talk about that first. I'll talk a little bit about what's the difference between our estimates versus our projections, what's the census versus our estimates base, and this is a bigger issue lately because we had to change how we do our population estimates base. I'll talk about modified race, concepts of our different vintages, what are primitive geographies, and just the order of how we produce the data. So there's a lot to read, but I made this table. I'll just overview it really quickly. So here I have 5 different products that our area creates. And on the left-hand column, so we have the post-census estimates, intercensus estimates, evaluation estimates, demographic analysis estimates, and population projections. So currently we're making post-census estimates, that very top line. And like I said, this starts last census day, goes to their current year. And these are the official estimates between the decennial censuses. Once we get decennial censuses, we also go back and we revise our last decade set of post-census estimates so that the starting point will still be the prior census, but then the end point will also be a census. So we adjust our time series that we created over the 10 years. For example, we're working on the intercensus estimates right now, and they go back to 2010, and they're revising all the years that we created between 2010 and 2020 so that the start and end point will be consistent with the decennial censuses that are public. We do this for every decade, and we have intercensus estimates on our website going back to 1900. So you can use them as a time series, and they'll be consistent across all the different decades. We have evaluation estimates, which are essentially estimates we create on the decennial years. So we have 2020 estimates of April 1st, 2020. And we use these primarily for us to evaluate how well our estimates methodology had worked over the last decade. So we see the having an enumerated population is a great time for us to see where we're close to the population that was counted, where we're different from the population that was counted, and then we can dig into the different sources of those differences. So the evaluation estimates are not official estimates in the sense that they aren't used for funding allocations and things like that, but they're used by us to revise our method. Demographic analysis estimates are also created in our program area. These don't actually have a start point. They're just an estimate of the population on census day, and it's one of the 2 official benchmarks of the decennial census when it comes out. So you might have heard about things like overcounts or undercounts. For example, the undercount of small children. One of the ways that people know that this happens in census counts is because of things like demographic analysis. Demographic analysis is based primarily on administrative records, and it tries to be as independent from censuses as it can. So that way it's not built off of like the 2010 census, which had an undercount, where the estimates would create that or would carry that undercount forward through the years. Demographic analysis doesn't have that as a starting point. It's just using birth and death records, primarily vital statistics records, really, and it doesn't have that issue. So you can really get a sense of if there's an overcount or undercount of the population. And then finally, population projections are created in our area. We release these kind of intermittently, and these go out around 50 years from the current year, and they start with our post-census estimates, and they move forward using a variety of methods for the different components of change. So this kind of gets a little bit more into what the differences are between our estimates and our projections. So they both are similar in some ways, where they both use administrative data. However, the estimates really are just our recent or current time periods. We use data to estimate recent or current components of change. We don't really make varying assumptions about the future with the estimates. We rely primarily just solely on administrative data to inform the estimates for the most part. And we produce these estimates every year for all different levels of estimates geography, whereas the projections project forward, and they have to make different assumptions about what the future holds for the population change. And we only produce them for the nation, and we only produce them every 3 to 5 years. It used to be the cycle. I think the last series we've actually released was in 2017. So they don't get released on a consistent rolling basis like the estimates do. So what is the difference between the decennial census and the estimates base? So the decennial census is just that enumerated population count that in all the geographic boundaries that existed on census day. And it's just the count. The count is the count. They don't make annual updates to it. They don't make any corrections, or unless there's there are methods to correcting census through official channels, but on our side, we don't change anything that we get delivered to our program. Whereas the estimates base is the population as of the base geographic boundaries are as of the current year. So in vintage 2022, we'll have the boundaries as of 2022 in our estimates base. So the same geographic boundaries will be in every year of our estimates products, and they'll be the most recent geographic boundaries that we have at the time of creating the estimates. We do have different corrections and updates that get into our estimates, whether it's the count question resolution program, CQR, or other administrative programs at the Census Bureau, which allow us to make further changes to the estimates base. So another concept is how the estimates have modified race. So the census data in the decennial census includes a category called some other race. But for our purposes, since we use administrative data to create the estimates, and a lot of the administrative data doesn't have some other race as a category, we have to figure out what to do with the some other race category and where to put the people that responded some other race. So we have this method of modified race. So we basically take some other race, and we have a series of rules on how these how the people get put into white alone or black alone in combination, just depending on what some other race category they're in. We did the same basic modified race procedure in 2010 census data, and we call it imp race, imputed race. And we're currently in the process of researching some other race imputation for the 2020 census and how we're going to do it for future vintages. And getting into that, what is a vintage? It's really just our way of saying a time series. Vintages are that whole time series from the last census to the current day. And so, like I said, we redo the time series every year. And so every year we have a new vintage. And the vintage year typically is the year that the data is being released to represent. So vintage 2021 goes to July 1st, 2021. And right now we're working on vintage 2022, which will go to July 1st, 2022. Every vintage has that updated base, which reflects the current geographic boundaries, the most recent administrative data that we have, any methodological improvements that we made, and also adds a year towards at the end of the time series. And because of this, because we use the latest methods or we have better administrative data, every new vintage supersedes prior vintages. So you wouldn't use 2021 from vintage 2021 once vintage 2022 is out. You would just start using vintage 2022. That's a best practice anyway. So this kind of shows different vintages. I'll walk through this chart. But so across the bottom, the first point is April 2010, and then at the end is April 2021. And you can see the different vintages on here, many different vintages. But you can see that Santa Clara City is in Los Angeles County, and it has annexed territory from the balance of Los Angeles County a number of times since 2010 census. Annexation just means they changed their geographic boundaries. The solid lines are 10 vintages of resident population estimates for Santa Clara. Since it experienced base population changes each vintage from vintage 2014 to 2019, some tiny and some more notable, you can see how the vintages, the solid lines, kind of move around. So if you see the big shifts in the lines, so particularly the blue and the orange, so that's between vintage 2016 and vintage 2017. That is a geographic boundary change. So there was an annexation there. So our starting point changed because there were more people now in that geographic area than before. So the whole time series shifts up to be consistent. So it's using the same geographic boundary the whole time. And so the pseudo line, this dashed black line, really just shows if you did end up using the last year of every vintage going forward, you would see how that time series has that big bump between vintage 2016 and vintage 2017. Clearly, if you were doing some sort of research, you wouldn't want that in your time series. So that's one of the reasons why we adjust it at the starting point, so that you could see the actual change that's going on in Santa Clarita City, sorry. You could see the actual change going on there, not just due to annexations. You might otherwise think that there was just some huge population boom in one year for this particular city. So getting into geography, we have a special geography for the estimates program called primitive geography. It's a sub-county estimates geography, even though counties sometimes are primitives. Essentially what a primitive geography is, it's a mutually exclusive and exhaustive geographic area for our program, where you could sum up all the primitives in the country and you would end up getting the national total population. It's the lowest level of estimates geography we have in the estimates, and it's in the smallest bits that we need to create all those different city and town estimates, the county estimates, everything geographically. And it does vary by state and county, just depending on their geographic boundaries. And here's an illustration of primitive geographies. So these are made up states and counties. They're named by colors, so bear with me. So you can see that the blue county on the west side, and pink county in northeast, and the gray county in the southeast. The sub-county geographic areas can nest completely within a county, which you could see with those dark blue circles that are labeled 1 or 2. I don't know if I can do a laser pointer, but maybe you can see my mouse. 1 or 2 here. So those are completely within that county. They're not split, but primitive geographies can overlap county boundaries, as you can see here, where the 4 is between these 2. Or 3, this big purple city is actually split between 3 different counties. So what happens is if there's a split, if you look down in the bottom right, we end up making primitives out of that split. So looking at number 4 here, down it becomes J and K. So J and K are 2 different primitive geographies. And then I and L are just the balance of those particular squares. So the way this would work is if you wanted to get the population of the city, the red city, you would have to add the primitives j and k together. Now, in our estimates, we actually have many summary levels in our sub-county estimates products, so you don't have to do this. We do it for you. But this is more to illustrate what a primitive geography is for our purposes, where you could sum up all these different bits on this bottom right-hand little infographic here, and it would add up to the sum of the 3 counties that you see in this example. So you get all the little cities and towns added together and all their parts, and the balance of those counties or the balance of the city or whatever it might be. It takes a while to kind of get a hang of this in the estimates program. I think it's one of the more difficult concepts to understand when you're working with data products and to work with these data products. So if that was confusing, you're not alone. It is a little tricky to wrap your brain around, but if you have any questions or you need any more help with these, we're happy to help anybody navigate through these files. So our estimates production, the order of it. So here we are. This is how we make our national population down to our sub-county population. We start at the national population by characteristics, so age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And then we work our way down to the county total population. And the county total population then is controlled up to the national population. In a sense, it just means that we make the population, and then we also make sure that it sums properly up to the nation. And then once we have these county totals, we can create the state totals. And then we can also create we have the control to create the county population by characteristics. And so it kind of makes this incremental stepping into more complexity. So we start with the nation and get everything we need there, work our way down to the county total. Then we do the state total. Then we do the state population by characteristic. Then we do the county population by characteristic. So by the time we get into the end of our county and above production, we end up with a county characteristics file that has 31 race groups, 85 age groups, 2 sex groups, 2 Hispanic origin groups. So age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. These county total population estimates also play a part in how we create our sub-county population estimates. Now, kind of separately, and why there's a dashed line separating them, our housing unit estimates are pretty much made independently of everything else that our program makes, except for the sub-county population. So the housing unit method is different than how we make our resident population estimates, but it kind of does a similar thing where it has components of change. They're just different components. Instead of births, deaths, and migration, they're using things like demolitions or completions or permits. And the housing unit method starts at the very bottom. So it creates housing unit estimates for the primitive areas, the sub-county geographies, and then it just rolls everything up into the different geographic levels that we release. And when I get into our method a little bit more later, you'll see how the sub-county housing unit estimates and the county total population both play a part in creating our sub-county total population. Okay, so why do we do it this way? So we tend to see our estimates for larger populations more reliable than the smaller populations. So that's one of the reasons why we start at the nation and work our way down. And that's also one of the reasons why we work from county total populations to first, and then we make the characteristics after that. This also, the order of processing also relates to our requirements that the customers need. Like I said, we have that legal mandate to deliver data at the beginning of January. So we want to try to make those products first, just to make sure that we can meet that timeline. And also the characteristic detail that we create in our estimates program. A lot of that is really determined by what the customers need. For example, the American Community Survey, what kind of detail they need to have controls for the survey. So take a sip of water here. All right, so for the rest of the talk, I'll be talking specifically about the post-census estimates. So these estimates are the estimates that have the last decennial census as the start point that day, and we worked our way forward, but we don't have an end point yet. We don't have another census yet. The way we do this is we use the thing called the cohort component method, which starts with the base and then use components of change to measure change across time. So we'll use births and deaths and migration to see how the population changed since our starting point, and then that would become our estimate. The housing units also do a components of change method, but it's a little bit different. They have different inputs. They don't use births and deaths in the housing unit method. I'll talk about that in a little while. Our sub-county estimates used the distributive housing unit method, which is a mixture of our county total population and our housing units, and then some information that we get from the census. So the cohort component method, I've talked about this a little bit, but we start with the population base. We add births, we subtract deaths, and we add in net migration. It looks very simple here. It gets really messy really quickly, but luckily you won't have to really listen to all that. So let's jump into what the base is. So our population estimates base is the decennial census, including any kind of CQR updates, and retabulated into the current geographic boundaries. Before 2020 census, we just took the decennial census with those changes and used it as the starting point. After the 2020 census, we had limited access to the 2020 census data just because of scheduling issues. So we kind of combined some of the census information from the 2020 decennial census with data that we made in vintage 2020 regarding the April 1st, 2020 population. And then also we used some of our information from the 2020 demographic analysis estimates that we create in our program. We call this the blended base because it blends in those three different data sources. Our sub-county population estimates have base and current boundaries, and it's also one of our first products to create to include the new differential privacy method at the Census Bureau. We also, for the base population, have started a new research endeavor. It's called the Base Evaluation and Research Team, and this team is more specifically focused on looking at the census results and considering where we could or should try to make targeted improvements to the estimates base. Now that we have this blended method, it's possible to incorporate different data sources that have possibly some advantages. For example, the 2020 demographic analysis estimates, like I said, doesn't have things like an undercount of small children. So when we included that as one of our controls in the vintage 2021 estimates, it brought up national population of the smaller, younger population to be not undercounted in the estimate space. So there are some advantages to the blended method, and the BERT team is what we call it. The BERT team is really there to research what we should be trying to address. So this kind of gets into what the blended base looks like. This infographic is available on our website if you want to go back and see it. But you can see there's 4 different data products, really 3 here. So you have the red, which is the 2020 census, the green, which is our 2020 demographic analysis, and the blue, that is our vintage 2020 estimates. And then the boxes represent the different detail that we get from those different data sources. So at the national level, we get age and sex from our demographic analysis estimates. We get our Hispanic origin and race from our vintage 2020 estimates. And these all sum up to the total resident population from the 2020 decennial census. As we get into smaller levels of geography, we don't have demographic analysis anymore. It's only available at the national level. So we rely more heavily on our vintage 2020 estimates, which is that blue you see all around. And they still, all these different characteristics will sum up to the total resident population in the 2020 decennial census. So work our way down to counties. So states and counties are very similar. The role this national part has is because we want things to sum, the use of demographic analysis at the national level actually ends up trickling down into the states and counties because we get the states and counties to sum up. So, if you increase the population of 1-year-olds nationally, you have to also then somehow get the population to sum up to an increased target. So that's kind of what this box means. Age and sex controlled to DA distributions are from national estimates. So, yeah. All right, so let's talk about some components. Births and deaths are among my favorite topic, but we usually we rely on two different things for births and deaths. First, we start with our National Center for Health Statistics at the CDC to get really full detail data, but their limitation to using the National Center for Health Statistics data is that it has a delay in when we can get it. So for example, in vintage 2019, we could only get final birth data or final death data for 2017. So there's that 2-year lag, and then we have to figure out what to do for that 2-year period. Luckily, we have the FSCPE members who help us with this, and they provide us with birth and death data for their respective states with just a 1-year lag. They provide us total births and deaths for their counties, and this helps us just get a little bit more recency in our data, and it helps us not have to rely on a projection method as much to cover that gap. The method here, it's a little bit tricky, and it's changing every year. But essentially, one of the big things we have to do is a lot of the birth and death data up until recently was still in race categories that were established in 1977. So we had to have a system to convert those into the 1997 categories, which are more similar to what we have now. We also have to figure out what to do with race and Hispanic origin. So birth and death data, they don't tell you what the race of the baby is. For example, they'll just tell you what the race of the mother and the race of the father is. So what we do is we use a method that creates essentially like a proportion of households in the census that had parents with different races, and then they saw what they reported on their census, like what race they reported for their child. So if they had a white mother and a black father, if it was, I'm making this up, but if it's like 70% of them said that their child was white, then 70% of the birth records with this combination of parents would be white. It's called the Kidling procedure, and there's a paper about this out if you're interested. I can certainly pass that along. And then we create our estimates. We tabulate the NCHS data first by the different characteristics. Then we reconcile that with our FSCP data. Another way we use the FSCP data is it helps us better understand where the births are happening in a state. So states sometimes, FSCP members sometimes have a better sense of if there was a geographic change or if the birth or death data in their state had a geocoding issue that NCHS has in their data, but maybe the FSCPE has a way to fix that. So the FSCPE data, even though it does help us get that 1 year, it also helps us better distribute the births and deaths within their state to be more consistent with what they're seeing on the ground. And this is really a big part of the FSCP's contributions. And they've helped us in lots of states fix some geocoding issues we found in the NCHS data. And then we project that last year to get to that gap covered. So then we have data to the vintage year. Net international migration it's complex and it's not my specialty. So I'll try my best to answer questions if you have them, but I might need to refer you to our experts on that one. But essentially it starts with foreign-born immigrants, subtracts foreign-born immigrants, adds in net Puerto Rico migrants, and then net native migrants, and then net military migrants. And then with all those combined, you get total net international migration. To do this, to accomplish this, there's a variety of different data sources. Heavily relies on the American Community Survey and the Puerto Rico Community Survey. We also use NCHS Hispanic life tables to try to estimate the amount of deaths in particular populations. We use population registers and censuses from around 80 other countries that would have help us make our estimates. And then for our military movement, we use data from the Defense Manpower Data Center, DMDC, and they provide us monthly data on the military population. So how we use these different inputs varies depending on the geographic level or the subcomponent. So for example, DMDC is used for military movement, whereas the life tables from NCHS are used to calculate foreign-born immigration. And then for geographic levels, we might be able to use like 1 year ACS at the national level, but that data might be too thin to be used at the county level. So it just varies depending on how big the populations are. Moving on to net domestic migration. Domestic migration, the estimates program primarily relies on IRS data, but we also mix in data, and also Medicare data. We also use data, we call it the DCF, the demographic characteristics file, to help us establish race, Hispanic origin, age, sex, things like that. So to measure movement, we use the IRS and the Medicare data. We look at where people file 1 year, and then we look where they file the next year, and that could, if they changed counties, then they moved. We matched the different data sources, the IRS and the CMS data, to our demographic characteristics file to assign those characteristics, age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And then we end up aggregating all this once it's made into immigrants, outmigrants, and non-migrants. And with these, we can calculate county-specific migration rates that go into our processing. Multiple rates by population at risk of migrating we're just reading that bullet and I was trying to remind myself what I'm trying to say here, but essentially we have different rates that we use for different purposes when we're creating the estimates. Group quarters population is another part of our estimates. How am I doing on time? Oh, I got to go faster. I'm almost done. So the estimate space GQ population is GQ by facility type, age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And this starts with our last decennial census. And the FSCP members, such as your Tennessee FSCP member, they provide us essentially all we have to measure GQ change since the last census. So every year the FSCP provides us facility level information about dorms that opened or prisons that changed in population. And this is our only method in the estimates program to measure change since the last census. Otherwise, we would have to hold the census constant. So the FSCP is really huge here. Skip the method there for a second. So national population, like I said, in cohort component method, we have the most detail here: quarter year of age, 31 age groups, sex, Hispanic origin. It's monthly data, and a lot of the different parts are calculated through addition or subtraction. So for example, we get the household population by taking the resident population and subtracting the group quarters population. And that's all kind of summarized there. There's different universes, we call them universes. So we have like resident, civilian non-institutionalized, which are just the civilian population, not in institutionalized group quarters like a prison or a nursing home. Yes. So as we get down to the state and county total population, the detail starts going away. So we do have some age detail here, 3 age groups, under 18, 1864, 65 and older. And we do release the group quarters population and household population. And then we make the states after we've made the counties by summing. State population by characteristics. So the state and the county are very similar. We actually make the county, so they're very similar in how they produce their estimates. So I might gloss over the county because they're going to be identical. But at the state level, we have single years of age up to 85 and older, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. And with these, you can get 2 or more race, but then you can have race alone or in combination. So you can say, white alone or in combination with some other race. And we use these for CPS controls. We make monthly estimates, we have a short-term projection, and we release civilian and CNI populations for the CPS. Now, like I said, these are very similar. The one thing to note here is the county population by characteristic has this thing we call the college fix, which is really a special adjustment we make for counties that have a large college population. Unlike a normal county where the age the population ages forward every year, so you can kind of see like the baby boomers aging in place. Colleges have a big spike in 18 to 24-year-olds, but it never goes away. It doesn't get older because the college kids would end up leaving and new ones would come in and replace them. So we had to do a special fix for this where we hold the age pretty much in the same place, and it prevents that peak moving over time. So the housing unit method is a component method. It starts with the housing unit base, which is the census, adds in new construction, takes out housing loss, and adds in conversions. So using this method, it starts at the very low level. It's unlike the county and above. Housing unit flips it on its head. It starts at the very bottom, primitive level geography, and it sums up from there. The housing unit method heavily relies on FSCP involvement, where there's two different phases. We create the preliminary estimates, which are basically, we make our best estimate using previously submitted FSCP data from last year. And then we send it out to the FSCP. They give us comments, and then they'll send us back inputs, preliminary inputs with their new submissions. So the FSCP has an opportunity to provide us updated data so that we're making sure that we're capturing everything accurately. So this kind of highlights the differences between what we have in estimates and projections and what the FSCP provides us. So I'm going to focus on the right-hand box here. So FSCP, they can update any component that we use in our housing unit methods. They can also replace building permits and completion rates with certificates of occupancy. And they also can help us with conversions, so things that went from residential to non-residential or the other way around. For EMP, we do have things where we try to measure for disaster loss using FEMA data, housing unit loss, and we have a variety of sources that tell us about permitted housing. So we try our best, but the FSCP certainly does a fantastic job supplementing everything we do. So lastly, the sub-county population estimates. On the top, you can see the initial household population estimate is created by that housing unit estimate we just talked about, multiplied by the household population to housing unit base ratio. So in the population estimates base, the last decennial census day, we get the household population base and the number of housing units for that particular primitive geography, and we can create this ratio. If you multiply that ratio by the housing unit estimate, you end up with a household population estimate. And then just to get the resident population estimate, we take that household population estimate, we control it up to our county household population so that the sub-county sums up to the county household, and then we just add our group quarters population to that. And this is just saying everything I just said. One thing to note from this slide is that we do have a challenge program that is, I think there's a Federal Register notice just recently put out about it. So normally on a normal vintage year, we would have a challenge program where states or entities could challenge any particular population estimate we make if they have reasons to think that we did something like missed a college or missed a nursing home, or they have evidence that our numbers are too high or too low. So we receive challenges, we'll review them, and any challenges we've accepted are actually on our website, so you can go check out what they tend to look like. Also, special censuses are included in the sub-county population estimates. That's it. I think I have enough time for some questions, but here's my contact information, and feel free to email me. We can chat if you'd like. And if you have any general questions about our data products, that Coordination Dissemination Outreach branch in our area specializes in fielding those questions or helping you find data products that we create. If you have any methodological questions, feel free to reach out to me, or any other questions. I don't mind helping out. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Luke,
Yeah.
for covering all that. I know that's a lot of information for people. It's super important information, and we've recorded it so that you can go back and listen to it again if you need to. Just a reminder about how we want to do questions and answers. If you are on the Teams app, you can type a question into the Q&A up in the top menu bar. Just type it in there. We'll see it. We'll feed that. We'll read it and feed it back to Luke, because people that are in the browsers can't see the Q&A. If you're on a browser and you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand using, I think it's under the reactions menu. You can raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your question there. So if you have any questions, get those coming in at this time. We'll keep an eye out for those. Luke, I think the first question that I had for you was about the, I just saw a notice today about the vintage 2022 estimates and the webinar that's going to be coming out about methodological changes. Can you give us any preview about what kind of things might be discussed at that webinar?
Yeah, so every year we have different method changes. I think one of the bigger ones this vintage is going to be how we use NCHS race data in our births and deaths. Also, any improvements we made to the blended base in this last vintage will be discussed. So there'll be a few things. Also, if you missed that webinar, we update our methodology every year, the methodology statement on our website, and we also have release notes that kind of cover the highlights of our changes. But I do think it's going to probably be a discussion about how we made our base population, and teams like Vital Statistics or Net International Migration that did some changes to their method.
Okay. All right. So my next, again, if you have any questions at this point, just raise your hand and feel free to, we'll call on you and then you can unmute and ask that question for Luke. One of the things that I wanted to clarify a little bit was related to the housing unit counts and kind of the role of the chief building official and the role of the information that comes into the Census Bureau about permits and the source of that information. Is there a relationship between the building permit survey and the information that you use to update the housing unit counts?
I actually wouldn't be able to answer that because I'm not super familiar with the housing unit method that we use. But I do recall us using the BAS, I think that's what it's called, but the building permit survey. But I'm not sure how much it's involved in the processing. I will have our expert on that, David Armstrong, reach out to you, and he can hopefully answer your question.
Okay, and I will say, we have an option. We do, as Luke mentioned, if you work in a city or a county, and there's, I guess, two things to emphasize. One is you can chat with your chief building official and emphasize to them how important it is that they submit accurate information about unit destruction, new units being built, because that is in this post-census estimate is a really crucial way of keeping your population accurate at the sub-county level. So I'm sure that's where a lot of these challenges come from, probably having to do with those types of housing unit counts.
Yes, I think in the past decade, yeah, several of them were housing unit challenges. In fact, probably most of them, if I had to gander a guess.
And I guess the other thing to emphasize too is that if you do see issues with your housing unit counts or changes in the number of in net change between 2 years in a vintage, and it doesn't look right, it doesn't look similar to what your building officials have reported, let us know and we can dig into that. And as Luke mentioned, we can submit corrections on your behalf as the FSCPE designee. My last question, again, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand and we'll unmute and call on you. Relates to BERT and the research that's being done. Can you just kind of go back and hit that topic again one more time and help a state like Tennessee understand how BERT or DA or some of the other work the things that you're looking at could be used to address an undercount where it was the population or the post-enumeration survey estimated that the state had been undercounted by over 300,000 people in the state's housing units. So what's coming down the pike for BERT and how will that research be published?
It's a great question. So one thing to amend what you had said previously, one of the benefits about the relationship we have with the FSCPE is that we have this rolling annual update cycle. So if you do see things in your states or counties or cities that look off, definitely work with your FSCP partner, or our partners in the FSCP to get the things submitted correctly to us. So they'll be reflected in the estimate in the following cycle. So you don't necessarily have to go through that whole challenge process to get things incorporated into our estimates for sub-county areas. As for BERT, so it's still in the early stages of developing what it wants to work on. Right now, it's going through different subject areas and having basically going over what the different subject areas and population division saw in their reviews of the decennial census. For example, we've had a few presentations from our age sex branch just talking about some of the things that they've seen. We have also experts on race and Hispanic origin talking to us about things they saw when they were doing reviews of the census. Really just trying to learn more about that part of population division's role. And we've also heard there's a big undertaking at the Census Bureau, the FRAMES project, which is trying to incorporate a whole bunch of different administrative data sources together. So we heard from them about just some of that, what their work looks like. And we also have heard from people that specialize in coverage in the census. So at this stage, I think we're really in the learning phase of where, trying to develop where we want to go. I don't know how that's going to come out as publications. I do know that there's probably going to be a plethora of presentations about BERT in the future. But really right now we're kind of in the formation / learning phase, I would say, of our research. And eventually, hopefully, we'll get to a point where we can pinpoint a topic that we really want to focus on and see if there are ways to supplement with other administrative data sources like the post-information survey or using demographic analysis differently, or anything else for that matter. So that's where we are. I can't really say where we're going with it yet, but it's definitely moving. So hopefully we'll have some presentations in the future that talk more about it in some detail. I hope that's enough for now, though.
No, I think that's good, and I think your point about not having to conduct a challenge to get things fixed is a really good one. It is a partnership. It's a state and federal partnership in the production of these population estimates, and I think it's important to emphasize that that's the best working relationship. And as you point out, there may be a need for additional administrative records to help make not just these estimates, but maybe even the 2030 census be more successful. So certainly something that we look forward to having more conversations with the Census Bureau about. I don't see any questions, so it's kind of a going, gone. Feel free to raise your hand if you have anything. But I'm gonna wrap up with just a couple of things. The first is that we did mention the Federal Register notice that's out. I think it does two things. It opens the challenge program, and then it asks for comments about the challenge program. So if you have any thoughts about that, you can let us know. We're happy to help coordinate a response, or feel free to respond on your own. The second is that if you're interested in learning more about the Vintage 2022 estimates program and or the methodology and how that might change, there is a webinar that you can find information on the Census Academy website. And just look under the upcoming webinars section. That's scheduled for Monday, December 5th from 2 to 3 p.m. So that could be a way to continue learning on this topic about population estimates. And then next, after this, we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording for this webinar, as well as a few other links to things that have come up in the course of our conversation. I want to lastly thank Luke for being here with us today. Luke, I really appreciate you taking time to do this.
This is fun. Sorry, I kind of ran out of time there at the end, but yeah, thank you for having me.
We are right on time, so we did great. And also thank to Aaron Hatfield for helping coordinate all this. If you have any questions, feel free to email Luke. You can also reach out to me here at the State Data Center, and I'll stick around for a second in case anyone does want to chat. But enjoyed seeing you all online, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.